The parable that we're going to be dealing with this morning also concerns the economic troubles of first century Israelite peasants. It's not widely preached on. It used to be to a greater degree among evangelical circles in the 1920s and Catholic circles. This, like the previous parable, the one of the tenants, and the two that we shall explore next class, are very similar. They are the most difficult to understand parables in the Synoptic Gospels. John, as you know, has no parables. Turns out that Jesus had a lot to say about peasant economics. A scholarly exercise given to graduate students in a scripture course asked them to go through the Gospels and underline everything Jesus has to say about religion in blue. Next, the students were told to go through the Gospels, underlying everything Jesus says about money in red. The result, 3/4 of the Gospel texts are underlined red. So Jesus had a lot to say about peasant economics. The parable we're going to be looking at this morning is called the parable of the day laborers in the vineyard. We find this story only in Matthew chapter 20. Unlike the parable of the tenants, we don't have multiple versions of this story. It does not occur in any other known gospel from the earliest Jesus groups, neither canonical or extra-canonical. Unique to Matthew. So the Matthean version of this story is the only version of the parable we possess. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. Jesus said, "The kingdom of Skyvald is like a landowner who went out at dawn to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with them for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. Going out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, 'You too go into my vineyard, and I will give you what is just.' So they went off. He went out again around noon and around 3 o'clock and did likewise. Going out about 5 o'clock, he found others standing around and said to them, 'Why do you stand here idle all day?' They answered, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You too go into my vineyard.' When it was evening, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Summon the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and ending with the first.' When those who had started about 5 o'clock came, each received the usual daily wage. So when the first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also got the usual wage. And on receiving it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, 'These last ones worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who bore the day's burden and heat.' He said to one of them in reply, 'My friend, I am not cheating you. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what is yours and go. What if I wish to give this last one the same as you? Or am I not free to do as I wish with my own money? Are you envious because I am generous? Thus the last will be first, and the first will be last." Got a question for you. How can we avoid the pitfalls of interpreting this parable that we saw last night, with the parable of the tenants in the vineyard? So the parable we're looking at now, right, the parable of the day laborers in the vineyard, which we just read a moment ago, begins, the kingdom of Skyvault is like. The kingdom of Skyvault is like. Kingdom of Skyvault almost always mistranslated in your Bibles and my English Bible as kingdom of heaven. The word heaven should never be in your Bible. It's always Skyvault, physical Skyvault, belonging to a cosmology we no longer can have. Not heaven, which is perfect for our catechisms and our eschatology. You want to talk about heaven, the beatific vision, the state that the righteous saved in Christ or saved in God share in all eternity with God. Amen. Right. Heaven. Right. That's fine. A relationship that is eternal with God, the Trinitarian person. Okay, fine. Beautiful. But that's not the biblical it's related to. The biblical heaven, Shemayim, or Uranoi, sky vaults, the vaulted skies, solid, made of crystal, or maybe polished metal. Kingdom of Skyvault, almost always mistranslated as kingdom of heaven, is a politically correct way to say kingdom of God. In other words, theocracy. That's a big Middle Eastern idea. Theocracy. Theocracy, in turn, is a way of saying God rules everything. So it's like saying what God is like. So the kingdom of Skyvault is like, theocracy is like, this is what God is like. So to say the kingdom of Skyvault is like, is to say the God of Israel is like. Everybody got that? Okay. So you start the story off, say, theocracy is like, or the kingdom of Skyvault is like. You're saying, this is what God is like. The kingdom of Skyvault is like a landowner, who went out at dawn to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now earlier we learned about landowners in vineyards. Owners of vineyards are the elite. They have bribed the courts to foreclose on the ancestral lands of peasants. Would Jesus, the peasant day laborer, compare God to this guy? Okay. Why was there so much land foreclosure? The problem was the intermittent character of the rains. Rainfall in Levant is very unpredictable, folks. In the Bible, we read about the early rains, which come in November, and the later rains, which come in February, if they do come at all. If they do come at all. Often these later rains don't come, and when they don't come, the crop yields are significantly smaller. The result of this is that the peasants often are reduced to eat their seed grain to survive. This means that next year they have nothing to plant. And that means they will have to borrow, and therefore they will fall into debt. It was the borrowing of seed grain caused by the intermittent character of the rains that caused Galilean peasants to fall into debt and lose their ancestral lands. As we said in Jesus' day, debt foreclosure of land had reached such epidemic proportions that only 3 elite families owned half the arable land in Galilee. The Herodians, the Hasmoneans, and the Banim Hassan, the Hassan family. So when you read in the Matthean parable of the workers in the vineyard, the day laborers in the vineyard, how, quote, the kingdom of Skyvault, theocracy, God, is like a landowner who went out at dawn to hire laborers for his vineyard. Folks, this is a story about a landowner who has foreclosed on peasant land and has shifted it to cash cropping, growing grapes instead of grains. Remember, the peasants, they grow barley and they grow wheat in order to survive, subsistence farming. And now you're planting grapes, which takes 4 years to have a crop, 5 years for a decent crop. The peasants can't use it. It's only high cash yield for the elites, selling it as wine. Folks, this is what God is like. Think of Jesus' audience. Think of Jesus himself. So the story says that this landowner goes out one morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Now that detail is not quite realistic. Owners don't go, elites didn't do this. They hired somebody they had a slave that did it. They had a steward, a retainer that went and did this. Landowners greedy elites never directly interacted with peasants. You had go-betweens in this society. Landowners all had stewards, and undoubtedly the landowner in this parable has one, and they were the ones that did the hiring and the firing and the paying, etc. So in some way this story is artificially constructed, but that's okay, because you need to have a confrontation, and that's the point of the story. Something's going to be extreme. Sometimes parables, they exaggerate things in order to bring some point out, right? Right. So as you're going to see, it's been artificially constructed as a story device so as to create these kinds of confrontations did not happen. If somebody's going to get killed, it's going to be the steward, okay? But it's been constructed this way to create a confrontation between the landowner and the laborers. Such confrontations normally almost never occurred because the landowners always sent their steward. Landowners were living in Caesarea Maritima, or they're living in Jerusalem. They're living in the city. They're not living in the Galilee. So they'd send their stewards to do all the interacting with the peasants. Recall that we saw this with the parable of the tenants, when the absentee landlord sent his servants, his slaves, one at a time, and then his son to collect the rent, which was 35% of the produce. But this story won't work unless it has a confrontation between peasant laborers and elite landowner. Because it needs a confrontation between these two people, the peasants and those who have foreclosed on them, on their land, by bribe courts. This parable says a landowner goes early in the morning and hires some day laborers. They're standing idly in the marketplace all day. Why are they doing that? Why don't they go to people's houses and say, would you like me to do something in your land today? I want to work. Why do they stand in the marketplace? If they were American, they'd go to maybe a labor pool or something like, huh? Okay, good point. What were you going to say?
They could get picked at any time to go to work.
Yeah, it's a different world than ours. Okay, we're going to discuss that later on. The landowner tells the day laborers, go to the vineyard and I'll pay you whatever is right or just. He returns to the marketplace different hours of the day, each hiring more workers every time. At 5 o'clock, just before sunset, he again returns to the marketplace, says to the day laborers standing around, why are you standing around idly all day? Okay, he's a little clueless. We're going to explain why momentarily. The day laborers respond, because nobody has hired us. So the landowner tells him also to go to the vineyard. Then when evening fell, about 1 hour just before hiring the last bunch of the day laborers, the landowner tells his managers, his stewards, okay, beginning with the last and ending with the first, bring them up and let's pay everybody. So the landowner has created a reversal. He's going to pay the guys who showed up last first, so that the ones he hired first have to watch him pay all the latecomers before they get paid. This too is not normal. That's not how it happened.
That's not what really was going on.
That's not what would happen in the usual situation. Normally the guys who show up first to work, get paid first, they take their stuff, they get out of there.
Right.
They don't see what happens to this is a show. This is a demonstration that is constructed.
Right.
This story has been constructed in a peculiar way to create an intense confrontation. It says the workers came and received the usual daily wage. Momentarily, we're going to have to work on that translation a bit because it's got big problems. So it says the first workers came grumbling against the landowner, saying, "These last ones worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who bore the day's burden and the heat." Then it says the landowner responded, "Friend," hetare in Greek. We're going to have to work on that translation, friend, because it's got big problems. Might be better translated twerp. Think that's a problem, putting friend in there? Okay. Politically correct, yeah, but for who? The landowner says, "I'm not cheating you. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what is yours and go. What if I wish to give this last one the same as you? Or am I not free to do as I wish with my own money? Are you envious because I'm generous?" Envious, envious. That's a bad translation. We're going to have to retranslate envious. The parable ends with the closing remark, "Thus the last will be first, and the first will be last." Now I want you to think for a moment about that little concluding remark. Thus, the last will be first, and the first will be last. This is what preachers do, folks. They tell you a story, then they hit you with the punchline. So for Matthew, the punchline is, thus, the last will be first, and the first will be last. That's how Matthew understood the parable. This concluding remark, the last will be first, the first will be last, happens to be a very common punchline in the Gospels. See those kinds of reversals, right? All over the place. The only problem is this, that it is on this parable in Matthew, but it's stuck to a different parable in Mark. And it's stuck to a different parable in Luke. Well, what it tells you is, brother, that the first will be last and the last will be first was an all-purpose punchline. If you don't really get the story, you just stick it on there. That'll maybe make it work. Preachers can use it whenever they want it, whenever they need it. You need an all-purpose punchline? Just remember, the last will be first, and the first will be last. The fact that Matthew has chosen to hang this punchline on the ending of this parable, the parable of the day laborers in the vineyard, means that in his mind, what this parable is all about is that the last will be first and the first will be last. You know, the idea that the last will be first and the first will be last ain't bad ideas. I mean, that's a fairly common idea found throughout the Bible. It's a good thought. I like it. I think it's great. You know, does it have anything really to do with this parable in its earlier pre-Matthean form? That's very doubtful. But Matthew had the problem of needing to preach it. So like any good preacher, he gives his audience a good old all-purpose punchline. What's the moral of the story? The last will be first, and the first will be last. Matthew, have you ever picked grain?
No.
No, you're a scribe, right? Where do you fall in the socioeconomic breakdown of Jesus' society?
Top 2%.
So you haven't been picking grain, have you, Matthew? The last will be first and the first will be last is not bad as good as punchlines go. I'm not knocking it. It just does not have anything to do with this story in the pre-Matthean form. It was added later. So how has this story usually been interpreted in the Western world? First off, the conclusion of Matthew, which obviously misses the point, is usually and has usually been ignored by commentators for a long time, centuries. People trained in classic Greek would read the story and go, that doesn't belong there. So how do you deal with that if you're a classic Christian scholar? Just ignore it. We're not going to talk about that. However, much the last may be first and the first will be last may have meant to the Jesus group called Matthew's Jesus group, the Matthean Jesus group, the one he preached to. Most biblical commentators throughout Western history have simply ignored it, feeling that it was an inappropriate addition to the story. Secondly, throughout Western history, the almost unanimous interpretation of this parable is God treats everyone equally and is even superabundant in graciousness to those who come in later or last. This idea has led to a rather curious practice in early Christian times and throughout the Middle Ages. People would delay getting baptized and try to confess all their sins on their deathbed. Because the last will be first, and the first will be last. So imagine you're living a terrible scumbag life, and then at the very end, Emperor Constantine, don't get baptized. Because the ancient people, they very much were concerned when the moment they're going to die. Americans, no. That's the last. We are so artificial in this country, we put death off all the time with endless distractions. But the ancient person, they couldn't do that. They didn't have leisure to do that. So they wanted to know when exactly was they were going to die. Because if they could know when they were going to die, then they could rush and get all their sins confessed right there on the deathbed. They could live real nice, okay? Screwing everybody over, and then at the very end, I confess all these things. Whew, gets paid just like the first workers, the workers of the saints that have been working all their life.
And you go to Sky Vault.
And you go right to Sky Vault. That's right. Sounds good to me. So it's doubtful that Americans like us want to know the time of our death. We put that off. But Christians in ancient times ardently wanted to know the moment of their death so they could get baptized and they could confess all their sins right before they croaked. See? Yeah, that's right. So see what they figured? God was going to treat them just like the landowner treated the workers at the end of the day. Yeah. You could live your life in filthy depravity and cruelty right up to the last second. And then you enjoy the reward of those saints who had spent their entire lives in faithful, pious self-denial. So ancient Christians reading this story encouraged deathbed baptisms and deathbed confessions. By the way, our sacrament of anointing of the sick, used to be called extreme unction, right? Because of this and the last rites and all that, right? I remember watching a Murder, She Wrote. The guy dies, he's like trying to get his confession out. Oh, he died before the confession. And Catholics still to this day, that's the worst thing that could happen. Right, because God works like you know, if Billy Batson can't say Shazam, God's going to have a problem. I mean, this is ridiculous. Most interpreters in the West have understood the first day laborers in the parable as ingrates, often seen as being opponents to Jesus. What more do they want anyway? I mean, they're getting their daily wage. These freaking ungrateful people. They got their usual daily pay. All they do is moan, kvetch, and complain. Oh, they must be the Jews. That's how a lot of Western commentators have treated this parable. What's extremely common in Western history is to interpret the first workers as the ungrateful Jews who did not like the kingdom being extended to include the latecomers, us Gentiles. In other words, much of Western interpretation has turned this parable into an allegory that is anti-Semitic. Here we go again. It is astonishing when you read Western interpretations of Jesus' parables throughout history how many of them are turned into anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish rants. This parable is just one of many examples. However, since non-Israelites did not join the Jesus groups until long after the death and resurrection of Jesus, that cannot have been Jesus' idea. All anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish interpretations of this parable are utter nonsense. First off, we have to ask about the likely form of the story as the pre-Paschal Jesus originally told it. In the Matthean version of the story, is this version likely the version of the story that came directly from Jesus? Highly unlikely. So recall that with our exploration of the parable of the tenants, we saw that the version found in the early pre-Gnostic Sayings Gospel of Thomas, probably that version was closer to Jesus' original than that found in the Gospel of Mark, which had become an allegory. Unfortunately, we do not have another version of the parable of the day laborers in the vineyard with which to compare and contrast it to. But you know what? We can still go to work. Virtually every New Testament scholar agrees that in their original forms, Jesus' parables lacked all introductions and conclusions. You can rest assured that all the introductions and conclusions attached to the parables you and I read in the Gospels are secondary or tertiary literary contexts and inventions of the Gospel writers themselves, stage 3. When Jesus told these parables in their original forms, stage 1, none of these introductions or conclusions existed. Why do scholars conclude that the original parables lacked intros and conclusions? Consider for a moment the parable of the great banquet, which is found in Matthew chapter 22, Luke chapter 14, and Sayings Gospel of Thomas, pre-Gnostic form, Logion 64. This is a story about a guy who goes out and invites a bunch of respectable people who wind up skipping the party, and so he invites a bunch of dishonorable, shameful types. When you read this parable in the gospel called Matthew, chapter 22, 1-14, you find this introduction. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables. Note the two words, once more. When you carefully explore Matthew, you realize that what the author has done is put together a big collection of Jesus' parables. Then he introduces them. Jesus said, ... parable. And then he stacks these parables, one right after the other, with intros. He said, ... and a parable. And then he said, ... and a parable, or another parable, couple parables. And then once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, ... and gives more parables. But in the other Gospels, that same list of parables is scattered all throughout the story in ways very different, in a completely different narrative arrangement than the one found in Matthew. What does that tell you? That tells you that Matthew and Mark and Luke are looking at this pile of, they have access to a pile of parables. We'll call it the pile of parables. And they're just grabbing these parables and dropping them into their narrative different ways. I'll put this one when Jesus is in Capernaum. I'll put this one where Jesus is in the temple. I'll put this one over here. Okay? The context depends, it acquires a new context, which becomes the narrative of the particular gospel we're reading. What was the original context? There is no original. We don't have it. We also find the kingdom of Skyvault may be compared to in Matthew. That phrase, the kingdom of Skyvault, appears in no other New Testament writing other than Matthew. Matthew uses this phrase to introduce a large share of the parables. But only Matthew does this. And when we find a parable that is in Matthew and also in Mark and in Luke, And the intro, the kingdom of Sky Vault may be compared to, does not appear in the Markan version and does not appear in the Lucan version of the same story, the same parable, then it's very easy for you, isn't it, to arrive at the idea that this phrase, the kingdom of Sky Vault, is a Matthewism, unique to Matthew. Stage 3, Matthew, and doesn't come from stage 1. Think about this because it does something rather extraordinary to your reading. If we stick the introductory phrase onto the parable of the great banquet so that it begins, the kingdom of Sky Vault, theocracy, God, may be compared to a king, can you see how quickly that king becomes an analog for God? So that it is God who's throwing the great banquet? God is king, right? But if the introductory phrase wasn't originally on the pre-Paschal Jesus' lips when he told the original story of the great banquet, maybe we're not talking about God when we talk about the wealthy man who throws the banquet. Maybe we're talking about a greedy son of a bitch who's foreclosed on peasants' lands. What do you think?
Possible.
And in fact, when you examine some of the parables that Matthew has stuck the kingdom of Sky Vault may be compared to, and you then look over at the same parable found on the other Gospels where that intro phrase is missing, it becomes crystal clear that the character in the story cannot be an analog for the God of Israel. Here's another punchline. For many are called, but few are chosen. The Calvinists love this one. Some people who like to think of God as Jehovah the Hutt also like this one. You know, Jehovah the Hutt from Star Wars. Matthew also attaches a concluding punchline onto the parable of the great banquet. For many are called, but few are chosen. Know for sure, folks, that Jesus, pre-Paschal Jesus, never concluded his original parable with that. Stage 1. How can we know for sure? For many are called, but few are chosen is just another example of an all-purpose punchline taken from the stock repertoire of Matthew. The author of Matthew sure likes that one. He likes to stick it onto a whole bunch of things. He sticks it on the end of different parables. It's one of his favorites. For many are called, few are chosen. It also appears elsewhere in the other synoptic gospels, but curiously not on their version of this story. What does that tell you? You got multiple versions of the same story. Some stories have, one of them has, for many are called, few are chosen. The other two versions don't have that as the ending. Then you think, when Jesus told this story, could he have put that on the end? No. No. It's just a common preacher all-purpose punchline, folks. Preachers do that all the time. In Matthew, the parable of the great banquet is a wedding feast. But in Luke, this same story is no wedding banquet. Jesus is having dinner at the house of a rich guy. Now, having dinner at the house of a rich guy and a wedding banquet, those are two very different contexts, aren't they? That changes it, right? In the Lucan form, the dinner guests are conversing, and one of the guests says, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom." What follows this is, quote, "And then Jesus said to him," and what follows is the Lucan version of the parable of the great banquet. That's a wholly different introduction than you get in Matthew. It's the same story, but it's recontextualized with a different intro. If you look next at the conclusion of the parable of the great banquet in Luke, it is this, quote, "I tell you, none of these invited will taste my dinner." That's very different than the Matthean conclusion, which is, "For many are called, few are chosen." Wait a minute, what's the meaning of the story? Is it, "I tell you, none of those invited will taste my dinner"? Or is it, "For many are called, but few are chosen"? Now, the parable of the great banquet also happens to appear found in the Sayings Gospel of Thomas. The only intro we get there is Jesus said. That's how the Gospel of Thomas is. Jesus said, da-da-da-da. Jesus said, da-da-da-da. Jesus said. That's it. No more context. It's not a dinner at a rich guy's house. It's not a wedding either. It's just Jesus said, and then the story comes out. But the Sayings Gospel of Thomas does give you a punchline for this parable. And it is this, quote, "Buyers and merchants will not enter the places of my Father." Wow. This is a guy who doesn't like merchants. That's a completely different punchline than "For many are called, but few are chosen" in Matthew. And "I tell you, none of those invited will taste my dinner" in Luke. It's this kind of internal evidence, folks, that shows to scholars that the intros and concluding punchlines that you find in the gospel parables are the inventions of the writers of the Gospels, stage 3, and did not originate with the pre-paschal Jesus, stage 1. While we have only explored one example of this with the parable of the great banquet, we could see this same thing in many other variant parables. Whenever a given homilist or preacher gets a hold of a story, they imagine this is the point of the story, one way. And by the time you get a hold of the story, you think, no, this is the point of the story. And the result of this is your punchline differs from the preacher's punchline. Gospel of Matthew. The punchline is, to Matthew, "Many are called, but few are chosen." Gospel of Luke. The parable, "No, none of those invited will taste my dinner." Gospel of Thomas. "Buyers and merchants will not enter the places of my Father." This is just the messy way human beings work, folks. We like to think everything is uniform and perfectly one. That's not how it is with truth, folks. More like a diamond and the light. So, Gospel of Matthew, parable of the day laborers of the vineyard. The intro, "The kingdom of Sky Vault is like." The conclusion, "The last shall be first and the first shall be last." So this leads us to the next step of getting to the roots of the parable, this parable we're looking at in this presentation. We're going to have to remove, aren't we, the introduction and the concluding punchline, because those were created stage 3 by Matthew. I don't want to remove them from our Bibles or our lectionary, mind you, but we have to remove them here in Bible Alive for now if we're going to try to get at what this parable originally was in the mouth of Jesus, because those two phrases were not there. If we remove the introduction, "The kingdom of Sky Vault is like," we have subtracted one of the favorite phrases of Matthew. Doing that, we have also dropped the notion that the vineyard owner is an analog for God, right?
Right.
If the peasant artisan turned folk healer Jesus got up and told his peasant audience, "I want to tell you a story about a vineyard owner," would any of his peasant listeners have taken from that he was about to hear a story about somebody who was like God? We also have to take off the ending because it's a punchline cooked up by a later preacher. The last will be first and the first will be last is a free-floating saying Matthew has decided to drop in whenever he needs it. It's found in completely different stories in Mark 10 and Luke 13. Matthew uses the last will be first, the first will be last several times. It was a favorite punchline of his. Those ain't bad ideas. The first will be last, the last will be first. It just does not belong here. So let's drop it. Okay, next thing we have to do is look very carefully at the Greek behind the question English translation of the story and ask ourselves, how is this being translated? Traditory, traditory. All translations are betrayals. Because whenever you move the language, you necessarily change the meaning. You don't read Greek, and that's okay, but we're going to have to look at this parable through 3 different English translations side by side. How does that sound? And I'll show you the problems. So the first version we're going to look at, we're going to put them all parallel. Look up on the screen. First is the 1611 King James Version of Matthew 20, verse 1. We'll also look at the 1952 Revised Standard Version of Matthew 20, verse 1. And we'll look at the 1989 New Revised Standard Version of Matthew 20, verse 1. So the 1611 authorized, whose version? The King James Version. A man that is a householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. 1952 RSV. A householder who went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. This is one of the criticisms of the RSV, by the way. It's very slavish to the King James Version. But then the new, that's why you need a new Revised Standard Version, right? NRSV, 1989. A landowner. See the difference? Who went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. Take a look at the King James Version word householder, repeated by the RSV, but changed by the NRSV, instead has landowner. The actual Greek is oikodespote, which literally means a house master or a house despot, right? Just talking about that with Vinny over here. The RSV's landowner is probably legitimate because ancient writers used oikodespote in that sense. Let's move along to verse 2. Look at those for a moment. King James Version, and when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day. Ooh. A penny a day. That's the English penny, by the way. That's what they paid people back then, in English pennies? Well, that was the usual daily wage in 1611, Shakespearean times. RSV 1952, after agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day. Okay, now we're not even translating, we're just dropping the Greek word in. 1989 New Revised Standard Version, after agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, which is also in our New American Bible that I read from earlier. So look at the King James Version, a penny a day. Holy smokes, that is messed up. At least it's messed up for our impression nowadays. 1611 translators are thinking of their old English penny. 1611, that was the usual daily wage for unskilled manual laborers. Oops. The Greek actually says denariu, which the RSV renders literally as denarius. A denarius was silver in Roman coinage, but denarii, that's plural for denariu or denarius, existed outside of Rome. Some were made of copper, some were made of bronze, and they had varying values. The NRSV has translated denariu as the usual daily wage. They did that because people today don't have a clue what that value was. But we're going to have to be much more careful than the RSV's very clumsy rendering, and we're going to see why momentarily. Let's move to verse 3. Here we have a time reference. King James Version, he went out about the 3rd hour. In 1952, RSV, and going out about the third hour. 1989, NRSV, when he went out about 9 o'clock. Wow, that's a big difference. Third hour, 9 o'clock. Look, the NRSV is trying to help us modern readers. We don't think of the day beginning at 6 a.m. as the first hour, 9 a.m. as the third hour, 12 noon is being, right, in watches, right, throughout the night, and the 6 p.m. is the 12th hour and all that. We don't think of it like that. So just put in 9 o'clock. Moving right along. Oops. Verse 13, but he answered one of them, the King James Version, and said, Friend, I do thee no wrong. Didst thou not thou agree with me for a penny? 1952 RSV, but he replied to one of them, Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? 1989 NRSV, but he replied to one of them, Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? They all have friend. That's the key word I want you to look at here. All translations render the Greek hetare as friend. That's a real doozy of a problem in translation, because hetare doesn't really, it means friend. It's perfectly fine to use that to a child. But if you call a grown-up man hetare, that's real bad. So a better translation would be something like punk. But all three translations miss that. It's demeaning, derogatory. When hetare is used for a child, it is positive. It's like a friendly address that a honor superior, an adult, would use of a boy. To give you the idea of what hetare means when one male, adult male, calls another adult male hetare, we have a modern equivalent. Imagine if you go up to if you're a Anglo-American, and you go up to an African-American and call him boy.
Problem.
That is what hetare connotes. It's demeaning, patronizing, degrading.
You can argue the same way if you call another person your age son or something like that.
Yeah, right. How you use that, if you're using it in the context of the song Soul from the great prophetic show Boondocks, to call your brother son, the story that's just begun, okay, I love that, then it's fine. But if you're, hey, listen, son, I'm not your son. What do you mean by that? Yeah, it's very demeaning, patronizing, literally patronizing. To call a male adult hetare is insulting in the extreme. That's missed in all three translations. Friend cannot be the proper translation of hetare. We have all kinds of evidence from antiquity showing the proper use of hetare with children and the denigrating and insulting use of hetare with adults. This landowner could not possibly be saying, look, friend. He's not meaning like that. He's saying,
You're calling him up.
right, exactly. You're having a confrontation. Look, punk.
Right.
Something like twerp.
Yeah.
Little piece of That's what he's calling him.
Right. You get what I give you.
Exactly. That's what you deserve. I tell you what you deserve. 1611 King James Version, 1952 Revised Standard Version, NRSV, 1989. Verse 15. Is it not lawful for me to do what I will with mine own? Is thine eye evil because I am good? That's the KJV. The Revised Standard Version says, or do you begrudge my generosity? NRSV, or are you envious because I'm generous? That's what our New American Bible for the Catholics in here says. Envious. The King James Version gets this correct. The Greek ho ophthalmos su poneros literally says you have the evil eye. How many of you are wearing jewelry right now that has a protection against the evil eye? Latins? Anyone from the Middle East? Anybody? Does anyone here have any? Okay. Do you know Jesus wore that? He had a little purple fabric hanging from the tassel as a protection, the color of sky vault. That's a protection against the evil eye. When Jesus, the pre-Paschal Jesus, healed people, like the blind people, why did he spit? That's a protection against the evil eye.
Where does he say that?
Doesn't. The author expects you to know that. It expects you to know auxiliary background information, because it's not writing for Americans. It's writing for ancient Mediterraneans. I'm sorry?
I saw that in the Bible where he said spittle.
He spittle, yeah, and he puts it on the man's eyes that were blind.
It uses spit.
Mud and spit, that's right. The spit does two things. It protects and possibly is a healing. Obviously, we're not talking about biomedical now, are we? Any nurses in here? Not really. But in this cultural consensus reality, blind people, see, they don't understand eyesight, folks. Let me explain why. Ancient people believed that the human heart was the source of light that came up through the body, out through the eyes at instantaneous speed. Not 186,292 miles per second. Instantaneous speed. Whatever that light touched, you see. They didn't understand optics. They didn't understand that light came in through the eye. That was a discovery that happened in the Middle East later. They didn't understand this at this time. They thought the eyes were made of fire. Aristotle and Jesus. The eye is the lamp of the body. So light comes out through the eyes. The light begins in your heart, shines out through your eyes like lanterns. Ancients did not know that light comes into the eye. They believed that the light originated in the human heart was either good light or bad light. If you're a blind person, by the way, you're emitting darkness out of your eyes, because they didn't see darkness as the absence of light. They saw darkness as another kind of ray. If you have a wicked heart, then the light that comes out through your eyes and hits another person will damage them, hurt them, harm them, or even kill them. This is called the evil eye, and mal ojo, right? Anthropologists all over the world to this day can document the cultural syndrome that people literally get physically injured by the evil eye. That doesn't compute very well with our modern Western 20% of the world. But it's documented in anthropological medical journals. If you believe in the evil eye, it can affect you.
It's even the DSM, but they consider it a disorder or a mental...
A cultural syndrome, exactly right. Talking about
Evil eyes in the DSM?
Yeah, they talk about it in the Asians mostly, but it's also for other places.
Yeah.
Well, again, the Bible talks about the renewing of, the daily renewing of our mind. What's that all about?
Yeah, that's right. And the mind, they're not thinking of the brain, which they maybe think of as a coolant system for the head. That's about it. That's why the Egyptians pulled it out of the head and threw it away. Didn't know what its purpose was. The heart is the mind. Cardia anus. That's where you meet God in your heart, right? Only God knows what's in your heart, because these people are not only non-introspective, Americans, they're anti-introspective. They can't know what's inside them. If they get any of that knowledge, it's only because God, watch, has revealed it to them. Because God's breath is everywhere. His spirit is everywhere. The wind all around us. The landowner accuses the day laborers of having the evil eye. This means the landowner accuses them of having a bad heart. Envy is the root of the problem. That's why the NRSV and the NAB render it as envy. But that's an imperfect rendering, because there's a lot more being implied, isn't it? That's not a part of our cultural world, but that's the world of Jesus, folks. So what can we know about the characters in the story Jesus tells his audience? And how would peasants have reacted to this story, having heard it from Jesus? The landowner who owns a vineyard. You should know what that means. If a landowner owns a vineyard, he owns unjustly foreclosed on ancestral lands of peasants, turned the lands into cash cropping. This landowner has a steward, and this too suggests his elite status. Cato the Younger, who died 49 BCE, is a Roman writer and has a long discussion of duties and responsibilities of a steward. They were held very accountable. Cato becomes furious because one of his stewards does not wake up early enough and goes to bed before some of the other workers. The steward has to be the first one to wake up and the last one to go to bed. The fact that the landowner does not know how many day laborers he needs suggests that the vineyard is grown on newly acquired land. Think about it. The landowner goes out at 9 a.m., then he goes out at noon, then he goes out at 3 p.m., and then at 5 p.m. He's rather inexperienced in this enterprise. Why did he not know how many workers he needed for his vineyard? This suggests a rather detached landowner. That's what most landowners were. Probably with newly acquired land acquired to him through a kangaroo court, and he doesn't know how many day laborers exactly that he needs, so he keeps going back to get more.
Check on progress.
If the land is newly acquired, the threat of retaliatory violence looms. Remember the story we just read last night of the parable of the tenants. Again, we have a growing body of evidence from antiquity that this kind of retaliatory violence did in fact occur and was very common in the Middle East, of the world of Israel in the first century, in the Galilee specifically. If this is newly acquired land, understand that the story is set in a very high tension. A confrontation is brewing between the greedy landowner who has bribed the courts to acquire new land from peasant foreclosure and those peasants whom he has now hired as his laborers. It is probably unrealistic that the landowner comes to this vineyard, his own vineyard. He'd be in the city, safe, far away behind walls. This is the only story from antiquity where it happens, where the landowner actually comes to physically confront and be in the same space as the peasant laborers. Confrontations always would occur with the stewards, not directly with the landowners. But again, it is artificially being told to create the confrontation, which is the point of the story. The stewards are the agents of an absentee landowner. Normally, the stewards pay the day laborers at the end of each day. Why do they pay them every single day? Cato the Younger says, quote, "Do not ever hire the worker 2 days in a row. Do not ever hire the same worker 2 days in a row, because if you do that, they will begin to gain expectations." Cato warns his stewards that you never want a worker who develops a relationship with you, because if you do that, they will begin to expect things from you and you will become obligated to them. Cato wants his stewards to keep day laborers at arm's length and anonymous. We have handsomely here in America fulfilled Cato 100 times more. Because if you see, Cato figures this: if you can keep them at arm's length and anonymous, then you can treat them as employees and not friends. With friends, you owe obligation to.
And they won't become entitled.
Right. If you were to see the social stratification of the ancients, day laborers in most societies were ranked below slaves. They were either the non-inherited sons a farm couldn't support or peasants who had lost their lands to debt foreclosure. They are the outcasts, the marginalized, the most marginal people in any society. You're starving with 50 to 100 people in your household complex. in the Galilee somewhere. Where does Jesus get his stories from, folks? And then we pray, we read them so glibly and so, you know. And then Jesus said, in a fascinating study, Carol Myers at Duke University conducted an exploration of age structures and populations. What she was attempting to figure out was not only life expectancy, but also the average age of death for males and females in different locations. So she considered the average age of death of a Middle Eastern village peasant male working on a farm in the 1st century. She contrasted that with the average age of death of the skeletal remains in an ancient city or town. One of the things Myers discovered was the average life expectancy of a boy or girl who had lost connection to his or her family and who had drifted away from his or her village and into the cities would be absorbed into the lower classes of the cities. The average life expectancy for such a girl was 6 months. The average life expectancy of a male in this situation was 18 months.
That's how long they lasted in the city.
What was that?
They had drifted away from their collectivistic village, their in-group, because of, for instance, debt foreclosure, and then they have to go to the cities to beg. If they're a woman in this situation, you can see how prostitution could easily follow. How many prostitutes does Jesus hang around? That they must not be allowed communion. I'm sorry, that's not Jesus. Oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't talk about that. You're not recording that, are you, Mary? Okay, so anyway, where was I? I don't know, something about that. Okay, so they get to the city, nobody's going to help them because you don't belong to my in-group. Remember, for the Middle Eastern person, self is a group self. That's true for all Mediterraneans, like Francis of Assisi. He leaves his self, that is his family, and joins the church as an order. That's another self, his new group self. Same thing with Jesus. He leaves the village of Nazareth and goes with John the Dunker, his new alter ego self. When John the Dunker dies, then he gets a coalition around him and has a political movement called the Jesus movement, which is religious and political at the same time. Self is group self in the Mediterranean world. Like 80% of people today in the world. You know, all those subhuman, non-Americans. So moving back to what we understand, this is how people could die so easily there, because you're not part of your clique, you're not part of that group. What's going to happen to you? You live in the city, and we have skeletal remains that show this. So this is science, folks, here. So why was this? This was because the lowest of day laborers work sporadically. Therefore, to translate denariu as the usual daily wage gives a wrong impression, doesn't it? Because they're not working every day during the year, 365. If they made that denarius every single day, then you could call it the usual daily wage. But when these day laborers only worked at harvest time and planting, their income was so pitifully low that most of them resorted to begging throughout much of their year.
Wouldn't they have like a common, like what we would consider minimum wage or that? So if you're a servant, aren't you?
The only thing common was the economic in-gathering point of the whole surround, which was the temple. But elites controlled the temple. They controlled the distributions of the goods that were stored there. What it was for was to be redistributed to the people. And please don't argue with me on that, folks, because I'll take you through the Bible real quick. And I'll show you how economics works in Deuteronomy and in the prophetic tradition. And the problem is they didn't live that way. Because the Roman puppets, the elite, I'm going to show you in the next presentation how it breaks down. What that temple was. Why was Jesus always so pissed off in the temple?
Yeah. Unfair. Unjust.
Unjust. Inhuman, absolutely. All those things. So they're begging. What are they doing when they're not working in harvest time and planting? They're begging throughout most of the year, folks. Malnutrition was extremely high. You find that in the bones. Diseases, by the way, do you think Jesus had? We've never found a first century skull. Think of all the images of Jesus you've seen like this, or Mary. We have never found a skull from first century Palestine with a complete set of teeth. Never. Disease rates skyrocket. Infectious disease was widespread because their food sources often were the garbage dumps. There's no sanitation in the city. The street, right down the middle of the street, human waste and animals are right there. And that's what you're living in if you're homeless and begging. That's what you're getting your food from. These are not people who make the guaranteed minimum wage. These are people who on occasion got work, and never 2 days in a row. Day laborers existed in these very large numbers in Jesus' day because of the epidemic of land foreclosure. They were in competition for available work. The overwhelming numbers of unemployed day laborers meant that they had no bargaining power. They could not negotiate a contract with a hiring steward who had his pick of whomever he was willing to hire to work at his pay rate. The result of this is that wages in Jesus' day were depressed. Day laborers were completely at the mercy of those from whom they sought work. Workers in antiquity were not allowed to go job hunting. Honor-shame culture. You don't come to me and ask me to hire you. You go to a place and then I come to you if I need you. That's a Western individualistic strategy. Let's go get a resume and, come on and go out. Did you go out 10 times today? Yes, Dad, I did. Okay, that's America. That's not the Middle Eastern world of the Bible. What ancient day laborers did, living in the collectivistic society, that's how in the Mediterranean, you look at a group of Mediterraneans, go to a Mediterranean city, go to Israel, and they start the day. And the Western people, what do? They go out and they go to the places of work. And what do the men do who are actually from there? They go out to the village square and talk and make connections, because that's how it is in the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean world. You make connections. You're a collectivist. That's what you do. So what ancient day laborers did, living in these collectivistic societies, is go to the center square of the village and wait. Go ask a steward, pardon me, but do you need more workers today? Would be absolutely inappropriate. Scandalous. You don't do that. These lowest day laborers were among the expendables of the society. They amounted maybe to about 10% of the population. These day laborers were among the worst off, suffered the shortest life expectancy, the most subject to disease and malnutrition, treated like dirt, bereft of any advocacy whatsoever, without anyone who wanted relationships with them, including the people who hired them. And they were constantly seen in the village square, begging and waiting to see if they would be hired. The landowner in the parable of the day laborers in the vineyard is confronted by those day laborers who worked the whole day. He retorts to the first workers, "What is it to you if I were to be generous?" Generous. Generous. He has paid people the same wage for working 1 hour. He pays others for working all freaking day. Let's ask how generous this landowner is. 1 denarius is being generous? He's paying these people shit, folks. And he knows he won't be paying any of them tomorrow. And yet this landowner characterizes himself as a generous patron, of a person, gives benefits to people. Perhaps we ought to be skeptical of his own self-appraisal. What do you think? You know how it always is with rich people and wealthy, well-off people. They always like to sing their generosity and how they're the most generous people on earth. Be very careful when you hear people say, we're the most generous, we're the most generous. Really? Be very careful with that kind of talk. Why would the pre-Paschal Jesus tell a story like this? I want you to think for a moment about the Lord's Prayer. the Our Father. We translate a line in it, give us today our daily bread. It's really something like this: give us tomorrow's bread today. Often a tekton, a handyman like Jesus, would be found among the day laborers. Give us tomorrow's bread today is the prayer of a peasant who needs to eat. The prayer for daily bread is a prayer for employment. A person working not just for his own stomach, but for 50 to 100 people in his compound. It means when we go to the village square today, oh God, please have somebody hire us. That's what give us today our daily bread means. Is that how you and I pray that prayer? If you don't do that for us, God, we don't eat. That's what give us today today's bread means. No one was voluntarily a tekton, a construction worker, mistranslated as carpenter, really an artisan, village artisan. In antiquity, nobody was that. The only one who was a tekton was someone whose family had lost their ancestral land. Could it be that Joseph's ancestry had lost ancestral land in Bethlehem? What the hell are these people doing? They're from Bethlehem. Why are they living in the Galilee? Maybe long before Joseph, perhaps with his extended family there, and they had to relocate to Nazareth? I mean, why were they living so far away from their ancestral land? Someone, perhaps long before Joseph, had lost the land. Perhaps they went up north and became day laborers. Hence, Joseph is a tekton, a village artisan. The prayer, give us today our daily bread, is the prayer of a day laborer begging God for help. Bread provided 50% of their total calories. Most of the protein came from grasshoppers, folks, and other things. Not too much meat. Fish, sometimes. What about the action in the story? The landowner sets the workers up for utter humiliation. He uses his stewards to deliver a humiliating insult. He shames the first group of day laborers. Might they be the original owners of this land, acquired by the greedy elite who is using it for a cash crop? Humiliating them right in front of their peers? These day laborers challenge the landowner. So he bullies these men, calls their leader or spokesman a degrading name, wrongly translated as friend. The landowner accuses them of having the evil eye. This is the perennial and familiar claim of the rich, made again and again in every society, that class envy makes the poor unappreciative of a patronizing charity that they're offered. This is the same kind of spirit that says when somebody cries out who's marginalized, the widow or the orphan or the abused person, says, hey, my life matters. Everybody's life matters. You don't say it before, you say it then. The workers are in utter shame. They are helpless, cannot do anything to respond. Why would the pre-Paschal Jesus tell such a story? It's because it comes from his own experience. Jesus, the village artisan, is the one who prayed that God would give us our daily bread. He remembers how the man treats workers. Do you see what happens when you set these parables back in the cultural context of Jesus' world? It kind of changes them a little bit, right? They look a little bit different. In its original form, the parable of the day laborers in the vineyard illustrates the petition in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread." This is the prayer for employment, a prayer for survival by the lowest, most marginalized in Jesus' society.